few things before we start. We will take the opportunity to take a picture after this keynote. The idea is to move down before we go to have a dinner together, those who are willing to go with us. And so before leaving the palace, please stop on the ground floor and we take a picture downstairs. Anything else? I think, yeah, for those who are coming for the dinner, we will move all together to this place. So just wait a few minutes and we will walk there in 5 minutes walk. Well, given what I was saying yesterday when I was sort of opening the conference, I think these two moments, the one before discussing about where the social movement filled, how we ended up with the social movement field, how it is nowadays, and the discussion about the field development. And on the other side, the 68 mobilization that is the other central topic of this conference is what we will discuss today with, and now with Donatella Della Porta from Scuola Normale Superiore and with James Jasper from City University, New York. So the idea is to give 30 minutes to each of our speakers, and then we will open the floor for questions. Okay, so it's Donatella's turn.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you all for being here. I know that it has been a very nice conference. Already the beginning was very nice. Unfortunately, I miss it, but I will look at it in the YouTube version. And I'm very happy to have you at Cosmos, and I hope to have you again in the future, all of you. We have some people who are already coming back often, and we like it very much. So what I want to do today is, first of all, to tell you how I went back to the 68 in my own work, and then to develop two main topics. One is 1968 in 2018. So my impression is that we talk a lot about 68 in this year, not only because it is the 50th anniversary, but also because there is a resonance with developments which are happening nowadays. So that there are some similarities, and that 68 became an important memory. And memory is the topic I want to develop in the last part of the presentation. In fact, as I will tell you, my approach to 68 was influenced by a previous work which I'd done with some colleagues on memories of important events, important democratic transformations, and in Southern Europe. And it was with this type of literature which has been guiding our work for a book that we published in Jim's series in Oxford University Press, that I have approached the issues of 68. So these are the two topics. 68 in 2018, so what can we learn now, what is the resonance, and how memory becomes important for movements, and which type of transformations in memories are important nowadays. So This is a book. Now I have also the paper version. It's in Italian, but there will be other version. And it was when this Italian publisher, Feltrinelli, asked me to write a book about 68 that I started in the beginning with a negative type of reactions. I said, no, not yet a book about 68. The publisher asked, maybe you want to interview Danny Cohn-Bendit. I said, no, not at all. And after my first negative reactions, I thought that there was indeed something that I could do which was new and a bit different from what had been done in the 10th anniversary, 25th, and so on. And it was to think about the 50 years after as something which was relevant for nowadays. So my focus was not on what was 68 then, but on what it represents nowadays. And for this book, which is an edited collection, I've contacted colleagues who have been working in different parts of the world about the memories of 68, and with the focus on what can it teach us nowadays, and in which way it resonates with what is going on now. And the book, in fact, is made of two parts. One is more typical type of chapters written by scholars working on the memory of 68, not only in the most renowned case, France, Italy, Germany, the United States, and so on, but also Latin America, Southern Europe, seeing how 68 wasn't a global type of event. The second part is instead done of interviews with political activists of nowadays, either old 68ers or young people interviewed by scholars. So I have one chapter is an interview with Pablo Iglesias from Podemos. One is interview with Costa Duzinas from Syriza. And another one, the one I want to start now, use for beginning my presentation, is with two activists in the UK. One is an old 68ers, and it is a minister in the Corbyn shadow government. Trickett, John Trickett is his name. And another one is, other two really, are young activists from Momentum, which is a political organization which was formed by young people in order to support changes in the labor movements. And even if I didn't tell the interviewers and the interviewees what I was looking for in this book, I think that their presentations reflected very much this idea that I wanted to develop, that there is a lot of 68 nowadays, and that's this is not something in continuities, in the sense it is not just what is residuated from 68, but it's a return rather. And John Trickett is an activist who comes from the labor movement and who grew up in an industrial area. He doesn't have a memory of 68 as a student protest, but it has a memory of the new left in the UK. And what he says is was resonant with what I thought. So he said, what you have now is a generation that has got the optimism of what we had in the 60s. The sense that things can change for the better. They think that it is possible to have a change, but that you have to fight for it. So generations which goes back to an idea of conflict, but also with the hope optimismus of possibilities for change, and the engagement in producing a moment. So this idea of a moment, which re-emerged also in some revisitation of 68, was embedded in the very name of momentum, and it was the idea of finding something that could trigger changes, actually doing something that can trigger change. And in order to do this, you need hopes. And what was interesting was that similar memory I found also in the interviews with the activists from Momentum. So they were millennials who grew up with the conservative in power, who said they struggle against hopeless, lack of ideas about the future. And then they at the perceptions that 68 was present in their struggle. So it's the Miliband generations of student activists in the UK. And what they said was also very resonant with what Trickett said. So it was sparkling a new moment, breaking from the status quo, being able to imagine a future in a different ways, connecting different type of struggles, empowering people in order to change their visions. And so I think that this resonated with my idea that there was a sort of parallel history nowadays, and I tried to develop it with reference to three concepts which are important in conceptions of formations of cleavages in society and politics. And so one first similarities which I see between 68 and 2018 is this element of a social basis. Now here, the memory of 68 has been very selective. It's what Eric Neveu also wrote, and Olivier and others. It is a memory of something which has produced at the best modernization. And it is also a memory of a moment which developed in a period of economic growth and different from nowadays. But if you go back to the sources, what you find there is also some type of, say, feelings, impressions, definitions, which we find also nowadays, that it was a moment in which you needed to act. So in the perceptions of the people then, it was not a movement of abundance. It was a movement which was triggered also by the danger of a nuclear war, still perceived as very active type of danger, and also in economic conditions which was not perceived as the boom, the economic growth, but it was perceived as challenging for specific generations and group of people. And in fact, in some of the sources I went back to, I found the term precariousness, which I had not expected to find, but which was telling, because the ideas there was that the entrance in mass in the educational system was not something that was going to grant welfare for people, but it was something which was going to say reflect and create societies in which there was a model authoritarian on the one hand, but also of deprivation and exploitations on the other, and exploitation of intellectual labor. And It is true that there was a new generation, which is something which is stressed in a lot of the official memory of 68, but it was also true that it was at the same time a discourse of social justice and a discourse of freedoms, a discourse of generation and a discourse of class. And I think that nowadays the reflections on new generations in politics are also addressing the role of a specific cohort which is living and has been living intense moment of struggles, intense conflictual moments with a very specific social background. In a societies which is again a societies which is very repressive, increasingly repressive, and perceived as challenging the very rights of the citizens, and even more for the new type of generations. Second concept I worked around is the concept of identity. And I found here as well some resonance of 1968 nowadays in two elements, which, as I mentioned, were not continuously important in the history of social movements, but rather re-emerged. And 68 was a moment of utopias, sous les pavés la plage, attempt to create innovations and to imagine a different type of world mixed with strong ideologies and politizations. Main discourse was the discourse of the New Left, which was framed in different ways in different countries, from the United States, United Kingdom, and Europe. In Germany, it was the critical sociology, but which developed a discourse which was at the same time targeting repressive cultures and exploitative environment. And I think that if we think about the long development of the movements of so-called movements of the squares, 2011 movements, and so on, there is a return to ideology. So it is not only because it is the 200th anniversaries of Marx that ideas of Marxism are re-emerging, and the usefulness is again debated. It's also a period of radicality. So if we analyze with Andrea Felicetti La Nuit debout, and the discourse of La Nuit debout is a discourse in which radicality became a very central and positive type of topic. And I think that here as well, this resonates with what is happened in the 68. So this impression that at the same time urgencies to act, but also the potential, the sense of possibility of acting and developing a different type of collective identity, inventing a new type of identities. Third, organizational level is usually the third concepts analyzed when you analyze the development of new cleavages. And here I think 68, with this emphasis on participation and direct action, is inspiring and is reflected also in the developments of movements nowadays. So the idea that you need to create alternative type of organizational structures, and that these need to be participatory, opening up to new groups. So prefigurative type of actions and type of developments that we saw in this continuous re-emerging of specific struggles was important, I think. And what I think is similar also in these two moments is the fact that they both are perceived as a moment of changes, of accelerated changes. So this use of the term moment, which has been addressed also in recent attention to theory of times and times development and intensifications of times, are also, say, help singling out these similarities between the two moments, because in both cases you have movements that were unexpected, that develop very quickly, that develop and spread at global level. And in these several chapters of this book are interesting in pointing at the fact that it was not only a European phenomenon, and also that the spreading didn't just go from the center to the periphery, but there was also a lot of what was going on in the Latin America or Southern Europe, which became focal points. These are moments in which the very development of movements triggers changes. So they build up on destroying structures in terms of institutions, but also in terms of frames of mind, and introducing new type of new forms of agencies. And I think that this is an important element of 68, that it is not captured if we just look at the conditions, and the same is true for the movements that develop nowadays. And here it is where I want to make also the shift towards thinking about the role of memories. So the subtitle of the book is The Past and the Present of the Rebellious Years. And how is the connections done? How is it that John Trickett and the young activist millennials of Momentum shared a same vision of the 68 as inspiring moment for today's moment, is also related with the ways in which memories have been cultivated and developed. So the fact that memories of 68 remain plural and contested. In several of the chapters in this book, there is a description of unofficial visions of 68, which was quite selective, which presented 68 just as generational movement oriented towards getting freedom and modernizing movements. But at the same time, other visions survived. And social movements are important players in keeping the memory of some specific events alive and useful for the type of movements which are moving now. So movements are mnemonic actors. This afternoon, earlier on, Elena Pavan was talking about the role of movements in the development of knowledge and as cognitive type of actors. And the memories of past movements is quite important and not often studied aspects. So the moments and the ways in which movements go back to the past is, I think, an important question. And the way in which counter memory tend to be kept alive, survive, and re-emerge. And here it is interesting in studying of memories, the fact that it is not only the memories of success which are relevant for the continuation of the movements, but sometimes also the heroic memory of failure. And so it is not by chance that together with the memory of 68, there are also memories of events which were considered as defeat, minor strikes in the UK, for instance, but that can be elaborated and looked at not as memory of failure, but as memory of heroic type of resistance which could feed the movements of nowadays. What is important here, I think, and in this book, there are also some instances of these practices is how memories are kept alive. So the fact that besides the institutionalizations of the memory in history books or in institutional practices, there are also informal ways through which memories tend to be transmitted. So in the chapter by Eric Neveu on the French case, he presents an institutional memory which is extremely selected and based on the partial memory of a few I say successful 68ers, but at the same time also the capacity through family type of transmissions from one movement to the others, through informal practices to keep alive some elements of the memories which can re-emerge. So that memories tend to be structured, but at the same time tend also to be available for activists to work upon them, change them, and find ways to make them useful for their own struggles, making them more resonant with what is happening and going on. So the reflection on memory is reflections about ways in which eventful protest, like 68, or the big moment of global protest, like also 1848 or 1989, help developing new movements. How past events tend to build a narrative of the evolutions of some movements. So in the research on the memory of the transitions in Southern Europe, we started with trying to analyze how transitions moments were remembered in the movement against austerity. And what we found was that transition movements and moments were important, but there were also filtering experiences, like the movements of 68, or in different countries, different type of moment, which acted as catalyzers of attention and energies. So the history of movements can also be reread, thinking about this moment as a chain of transformative events, as a chain of moments in which suddenly protest intensified, and it became from normal routine something that instead catalyzed the perceptions of a possibility for changes. And also what this book shows is that memory is important for movements, but also it creates tensions in movements, because movements have at the same time the need to present themselves as something new, as something emerging, as something innovative, but also to refer to the past as a sort of legitimation. And this tensions is interesting because it brings about different type of developments in different moments. So what we saw also in this book, Lorenzo Zamponi wrote the chapter on the Italian case, is that some memories can become too heavy for some periods. So the memory of 68 was a difficult memory in some moment of the development of the student movements, because it was something that was perceived as too exceptional to refer to in more routinized type of protest. But it is also a memory that can become again relevant in moments in which there is the perceptions of big, important changes that can be nurtured through the reference to important turning point. And this, I think, is something that is important for the development of reflections on the different ways in which memories are remembered, forgotten, adapted also in social movements. So in each movement, these aspirations for finding roots in the past and aspirations for presenting oneself as rupturing with the past is, I think, an important element also in thinking about movement as cognitive type of actors. And Lorenzo told me that I have 5 minutes left, so I want to move to 3 reflections which I think are relevant when we think about the memories of 68. One is how much selective. So there is in literature on memory, which developed in cultural studies, often in literature as well, the idea that what is important about memory is its selectivity. It doesn't take a picture of the past, but it summarizes in a biased and very selective way what happened. So the memory is selective, and it is also something which is plural and contentious, that it is contested in different ways. And this is also something which is relevant for the memory of 68 in the different countries. Contestation can happen at different levels. So in some cases, 68 is celebrated. In some cases, it is attacked. In some also anniversary 68 was celebrated, in others was stigmatized as a source of violence or negative development in the societies. So this selectivity is important, and I think it is important for social movement studies to reflect especially on the ways in which important transformative event has been remembered and the ways in which they became important element of identification for different generations of activists. Another question which I think is relevant is how much there is plurality in the memory of some types of event. That is, how much movements were still able to keep alive an alternative memory of a transformative events. In this book, there is a chapter by David Ost on 68 in Eastern Europe. The better remembered case is the Prague Spring, but there were also movements in Poland and so on. And what he showed in his piece is the way in which these memories was made latent by actual difficulties, which I think we have discussed also yesterday with Bela and others. So plurality is not to be taken for granted. It's something which needs to be investigated, and the capacity of movements to keep alive plural visions outside but also inside themselves is something relevant in thinking about how memories of the past can feed struggles of the present. So how much polyvocal the type of memory of an event is, so that different waves of protest can go back to different aspects of this movement for inspirations. And last questions is how much a memory is consolidated. So this is one of the main argument of memory studies, that memory tend to consolidate and become more and more difficult to change in time, because there are also institutional practices. So anniversary is, of course, a practice which tend to consolidate some types of readings of events. So myth, heroes, all these elements tend to say consolidate, focus, transmit a certain type of versions of events. But I think that what is also true is that these memories can change. So what in my introduction to this book, I went back to the main ways in which 68 was remembered in the 10th anniversaries, 20s, 30s, 40s, and nowadays. And it is not the same stories, because each memory is also affected by the present. So it's the past in the present, but it's also the present in the past. And so the memories in the 70s was very much affected by the wave of violence which had developed, the memory in the 80s by the pragmatism of the years. And I think this is also as an effect nowadays in the capacity to go back to the memories of 68 as a memory of rupture, change, and so on. So new definitions. So summarizing and concluding. Memory of 68 in 2018, something that some scholars call the afterlife of 68 in 2016, is a selective memory, where generation and freedom are the official type of memories in several countries, but in which unofficially also informal practices, social movement practices, and so on, brought about another visions, brought about a different type of readings of 68. Plurality and conflictuality, 68, what emerged is still a very polarizing event 50 years after, is an event in which several people say there is not yet a consolidated historiography, and this is also related with the fact that the 68 generations is still alive and kicking, and so claim the right to tell the history, but and this at the same time could thwart the capacity of other generations to appropriate these memories, but anyhow introduce element of plurality. So memory of the same events, also memory of removal, memory of betrayal, and this changes in different countries. The chapter by Elizabeth Jellin on Latin America and the one on Southern Europe by Konstantinos Kornetis both tell stories of high repression, 68 in highly repressive environment in which memories of the events are at the same time painful memory of repression, and this of course has an impact. And as I mentioned, memory are consolidated, but only up to a certain point, because the anniversary, the 50th anniversary is different from the 40th, and it's reopening a conflictual readings of the events. So the readings of 68 as a critical junctures that you can go back to as a moment of intensifications, from which, and this is my last slide, there is a potential to learn, but this learning has to be done together by different generations. So John Trickett, Minister for Relations with Parliament in the Labour shadow government, told Harakuki, someone else, who was interviewing him, Hilary Wainwright, it seems to me that all of that has been imbued in this new generation, so what we have done in the 60s, and I think there probably is something we can learn from each other to build the future. And this point is the fact that the past is important, but also that you can learn by reflections on the past, which are not only celebrative, but are also self-critical. And in fact, both in the scientific chapters, but also in the interviews with the activists of nowadays, what emerged was the richness of 68 as source of inspirations, but also the limitations of 68, which made for a very complex afterlife of 1968. One of these, I want just to mention the three on the basis of the three concepts I mentioned. In terms of social basis, John Trickett, but also others, were among those who said 68 not always or very rarely has favored an encounters between different social groups. And so the history of 68 has been very much affected also by the capacity, or very often lack of capacity, of the labor movements and new type of movements, labor and the students, or new social movements of the future, to come together and build a convergence de lutte. This happened sometimes. Italy was an example in which we said the working class met the students, but it was always a difficult and tense type of relationship. And what John Trickett said is that the UK was, for instance, instead a case in which the working class never met the students, and this had an impact on the future. Second, in terms of the identity, this transitional moment, this moment of intensifications of times are also moments in which the past categories are no longer sufficient in reading the present. So the capacity of old terms, like old definitions of left and right, are reduced. This is sometimes compensated by the emergence of idea of new left, or as Mario said, new left and new, which reflect the challenge of adapting the old type of categories to new developments, building new identities. And this is perceived for 68 as a still open challenge. So it was a period in which critical theory, new left visions, E.P. Thompson, Frankfurter Schule were important, but the reflections on them remain quite fragmented, and especially the transformations into a political discourse remain quite fragmented. The organizations is the third element of challenges, because this is stressed, for instance, in the interview with Pablo Iglesias, who grew up as a social movement scholar and a social movement activist, but points very clearly in his interviews to the difficulties of organizational structures that develop in intensive time, that develop in moment of transformations, to become resilient and to adapt to different moments. So I think that's this statement by John Trickett's different generations that can learn from each other to build a future based on the same hope and attempt to change and attempt to create, to trigger moment of changes, to catalyze this momentum, I think is an important way to look at 68.
Thank you. I'll warn you now what will become clear very soon. I don't know much about 1968.
Too young.
Well, I think I'm up here only because I was alive in 1968, but I will say I was only 10 years old, so I'm speculating a lot and have not done the kind of research that a lot of other people here have. But I want to sort of actually take up some of Donatello's last ideas about the fissures that opened up in 68. And I want to start with the hypothesis that those of us who study social movements are almost all on the left. And we almost all have PhDs, or soon will have PhDs, meaning we spend a lot of our lives, or have spent a lot of our lives as students and professors. As a result, I think we're much better equipped to understand student movements and the so-called New Left movements than we are at understanding movements of workers and poor people. And that's the kind of cleavage I want to talk about today. On top of this, there's of course been a kind of gauchist faith in social change, whether or not it's quite revolutionary change, but social change going in a certain direction, and led, or at least dominated by workers, sometimes with students as their helpers. So part of the excitement of 1968, especially in Europe and Latin America, was this promise of a real alliance between students and workers. Real workers, factory workers, the proletariat that Marxists talk about. But as we've learned time and again in the history of sociology, cooperation is not necessarily consensus. Strategic players can act together or act at the same time, support each other, even if they don't really agree with each other about why they're acting or about what they want. So I want to suggest, and this is nothing new, that there were two relatively distinct 68s that happened at roughly the same time. And they did support each other, but they had very different motivations and really could not have cooperated for very long, could not have cooperated past this very special moment of 68. And we see this in more successful revolutions, revolutionary overthrows, where the revolutionary coalition never survives its own success. There's no reason to think that had there been successful revolutions in 68, this would have been different. This is standard, in fact, for much or most collective protest and for collective identities. They have less unity than they pretend to have or than they wish to have. So I want to talk about sort of the utopian and the political sides of 68, or the two 68s. As an influential event, 68 certainly set us on a path in which it has become clearer, I think, how different the two 68s were. And I want to sort of compare Europe and the U.S., because I think the fault lines between workers and the New Left were always sharper, quicker to emerge in the U.S. than elsewhere. And the subsequent trajectory that I see coming out of 68 started sooner in the U.S. It's a sad trajectory, but the U.S., I think, has led the way. In essence, history took a step backwards, I'll argue. Well, in the U.S., 1968 was a different kind of year for the world of protesters. There had been a lot going on already for many years, especially the previous 5 years, but even 10 or 15 years before 1968 with the civil rights movement of the Southern preachers. That's one thing. Second, one of the most salient protest events of the year in the U.S. was the Democratic National Convention, which was a weird, deflating episode for most people who were involved. But I'll come back to that in a second. First, the background. The preacher's civil rights movement plays something of the founding inspirational turning point in leftist politics and in academic analysis that 1968 plays in Europe and elsewhere. Although it had been around for decades, centuries in fact, if you include slave revolts and abolitionism, the civil rights movement had several new moments of energy in the 50s and 60s. First of all, the mid-50s, the famous boycotts in Baton Rouge and Montgomery, which catapulted Martin Luther King Jr. to national celebrity. The 1960 sit-in movement, which got college students involved and soon got white people involved in civil rights. Then the black nationalism, quite different, black nationalism of the mid-60s, which ignited northern and western cities and brought a new sensibility and very different set of demands to the black liberation movement. Then there were college campuses. Students for a Democratic Society, as you all know, published the Port Huron Statement in 1962, laying out many of the ideas that we now associate with 1968. Although I think the Port Huron Statement, its influence has become larger and larger in later myth-making, as Donatella describes the mechanisms for, as you would expect from a group whose most famous action was writing a statement. They've been very good at writing their own history subsequently. The Berkeley Free Speech Movement erupted in 1964, inspiring similar concerns on other campuses over the next few years. So challenges to university governance had started long before '68. Then we had the Vietnam protests, which gained steam from '65 through '68 and then beyond, but they were going pretty strong by '68. Feminists were appearing by '68, but I think it's fair to say hadn't really gelled into a movement quite yet. Consciousness-raising groups were growing in number, but really I think more in the early '70s than in '68. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll find out, because Suzanne Staggenborg is there. Then in the spring of '68 came the assassinations of King and of Bobby Kennedy, dramatic riots in a number of big cities, and then tensions over the presidential elections. Those riots were the most dramatic peak of '68, and race was obviously central. But race even permeated what looked like student movements in '68. The famous Columbia University occupation, in fact, was about Harlem and the relationship between Columbia and the black community. It was led mostly by black activists who weren't, in fact, even students at Columbia. This part of the story has been downplayed quite a bit in the subsequent myth-making. So we have cases at sort of opposite ends of a spectrum. You have Mexico or France, where events were relatively quick, condensed into a couple months. You really had what felt like a moment with a certain momentum to it, much more than the U.S., where they were spread out over, events were spread out over a decade or so. Italy, I think, is somewhere in between, with labor unrest beginning in '67, very dramatic resistance spreading well out into the 1970s. Well, in a lot of ways, the American '68 also defined identity politics in ways that we become more and more important over time. Black identity, most obviously, it's what we think of as good leftists, but also eventually, not really eventually, white working class identity came out of 1968 very strongly. But what I want to focus on, actually, is American workers in 1968. Not all, but many were unsympathetic, shall we say, to the long-haired hippies in the streets. In at least one case, much overdone in subsequent history, they performed their own collective action, putting on their hard hats and going downtown to beat up anti-war protesters. In the most famous case in New York, it was actually their own union that helped to organize the counter demonstration, the pro-war, anti-hippie demonstration. But much more broadly, the working class tended to resent the privileged college students who made up the anti-war movement, who had gotten deferments from Vietnam for being in school, unlike most working class kids. So at the most dramatic moment of '68, or along with the race riots in April, the Chicago police famously at the convention rioted. It was a police riot, and they beat up protesters, more or less peaceful protesters. At that time, I think most working class Americans would have cheered or did cheer for the police, not for the protesters. They were not especially outraged by by Daley's police force. And I think that tells you a lot about the history that followed. It's quite a different history from 68 in France, at least as the myth of 68 has come down to us. Their cultural disgust, as it turned out for the students, left them open to a whole series of backlash mobilizations, beginning in 1968, but especially in the 1970s, backlash against feminism, against civil rights and affirmative action, along with the political mobilization of the Republicans and especially the religious right in the 1970s. The Equal Rights Amendment, the desegregation of schools were stopped dead. Women's rights continue to spread in other ways, but desegregation, in fact, has not continued to happen in the U.S., or segregation has not diminished. Desegregation as a program was really killed in the 1970s. So there was a large number of working class middle Americans who then became the so-called moral majority, the so-called Reagan Democrats. And you saw the cracks in the so-called, what had been called the New Deal coalition. You saw them starting to form in 1968 with George Wallace's campaign. And those right-wing movements were in some ways larger and in some ways more successful than the New Left movements had ever been. And they started in 68. So a lot of the lifestyle changes, the loosening of manners, that part of 68 continued in the U.S. much as it did in Europe, maybe even a bit ahead of most European countries. I can wear blue jeans to academic conferences. I don't have to wear a necktie, all those wonderful things that we all take advantage of. Ironically, the long hair and beards of the hippies, so-called hippies in the 60s, which the working class hated, they hated long hair and beards, became a mark of the working class itself by the end of the 1970s. Right? They remain a mark of rural America today. Now I'm the one with the buzz cut, not the working class. But let me talk about the political trajectory for a minute. In France, the communists at least, and a fair number of students, had a traditional Marxist view of revolution as the armed overthrow of the state. De Gaulle actually fled at some point, expecting this kind of armed overthrow. Mitterrand, the supposedly moderate socialist, made statements at some point that the government of France was not legitimate, even though it was the elected government of France, so sort of implying that armed revolution might be justified. And as I said, because of a kind of gauchiste romance of the working class, I think a lot of the student movement went along with this idea, which is what led Lacan famously to say, you want a new ruler and you will get one, something like that. And it's these attitudes toward authority, toward order, that are key, I think, to the two 68s. As I mentioned, in the U.S., large parts of the working class went in that direction fairly quickly, voting for Wallace in 68, voting for Wallace and Nixon in 72, eventually Reagan, and today, to some extent, Donald Trump. But let me point out another irony. One of the reasons for the successes of the right was changes in how political parties operate in the U.S. They were opened up to more democratic procedures as a result. One of the legacies of 68 that eventually allowed religious and other social movements, eventually the Tea Party and then Trump, to take over the Republican Party. The Republican Party was democratized in ways much as the Democratic Party was. In France, the process took much longer, or I'd say in European countries, the process took different paths. It took the decline of the Communist Party, the very long, gradual rise, resisted rise of the National Front, to give parts of the working class, parts of the lower middle class, a party of order that they could support. Muslim and African immigration, I think, was a trigger, much like the civil rights movement had been in the U.S. 20 years or so earlier. Now we see this kind of ugly nationalist populism everywhere. In the US, you can trace it pretty clearly to 68. I'm being a little more speculative about Europe and seeing roots there, but I think you probably could find a similar backlash starting then. There's also been a scholarly trajectory since 1968, of course. Lacan's warning points to and comes from the other 68, the libertarian new social movement 68, in contrast to the more authoritarian, the more radically revolutionary 68. This is, of course, the 68 that we all love, the creative festival in the streets of Paris with existentialist, Dadaist graffiti around, posters up, that moment of madness that was thrilling, everything seemed possible. That's, I think, the 68 that most of us think of today. People like not only Lacan, but Foucault and Turenne took up this 1968 and, in fact, helped create that 68 in their political work and their analysis afterwards. The new social movements that feared or rejected crude state power, that rejected the kind of revolution that the more dogmatic, the hard left, had pursued for generations. They found the kernel of this new vision in 68, but also in the rejection of the other 68. They admired one and wanted to get beyond the other. You see the two 68s then in the socialist government after 81. The struggle between the CFDT wing and the Chevènement wing, the more environmental new left wing and the more productivist wing. So you see actually Turenne's influence losing out in the early 80s. It was really his support of the New Left movements that his support of the New Left that had led Turenne to conduct his classic research on social movements at the very end of the 70s, the early 80s. And I think it was the apparent victory of the productivist left within the Mitterrand government that really put an end to that research fairly abruptly later in the mid-80s. As we know, part of the intellectual trajectory post-68 was a greater appreciation among academics of culture and the cultural dimensions of protest and politics. Bert Klunderman's mentioned Melucci, and collective identity is an idea that was unthinkable before, well, in 68, really, it was unthinkable and developed since then. This appreciation for culture, I think, was partly a kind of ethnographic respect for the people we studied, an admiration for their point of view, also something of an identification with them, as scholars were often part of the movements that they studied. It was also partly a recognition that people are driven by collective identities, by ideal interests, and not just by their material interests. Well, now theories of new social movements, we all know today, were misguided in some ways. In my own opinion, they were too quick to see gay rights and feminism as cultural movements about meaning and identity, instead of really being about basic human rights, about violence and citizenship. I think they were wrong to see solidarity in Poland as a principled moral refusal to take over state power. The great irony being that 10 years later, Solidarity did control the state. Their refusal, in retrospect, seems to perhaps have been more strategic than moral. But despite some mistakes in overemphasizing the newness of these movements, the new theories show that people are not rational actors pursuing material economic interests. But to get back to class differences, this insight was applied differently to the working class than it was to the movements, the more familiar New Left movements filled with former students. With the upper middle class movements, ecology, human rights movements, this idealism, this cultural work were largely admired. But at the very same time, workers, the lower middle class, were criticized, and I'm confident this is true in the U.S., and I'm not so sure about Europe, were criticized for not pursuing their economic interests. They were criticized for voting for right-wing Republican programs that helped corporations and, in fact, helped the rich, but hurt themselves. So they were criticized for a kind of irrationality very often among intellectuals. So the whole idea that the New Left pioneered a more cultural kind of politics, a post-material politics, including identity politics, is a kind of self-flattery that academics often engage in, I would say. In the U.S., I would have to say George Wallace and Jerry Falwell did more to create an identity politics that contrasted with economically based politics. The identities just happened to be whiteness and fundamentalist Protestantism, but they were very much identities. So this kind of blindness or bias continues today. As I said, intellectuals, especially in the media, but also in academia, condemn working class Americans for the way they vote, for the apparently irrational ways in which they vote. What's the matter with Kansas, says the famous book about this. The left, I think, tends to think the people of Kansas have been fooled, the victims of false consciousness somehow. Poor rural Americans, though, it turns out, pursue their ideal interests in the form of a fundamentalist Protestant Christianity, which in the U.S. at least has always had an anti-government, pro-market vision, has always involved a kind of rejection of science and expertise. Ideal interests have always been more important to them than their material interests in ways that we on the left are very reluctant to acknowledge. In Europe, populism today has a very similar strain of suspicion of expertise. And this is quite a change from '68. I mean, as I said, I was only 10, but in school in the '70s, when I was in college and graduate school, we were mostly concerned that expertise was a threat to democracy. Now, I'm much more worried that democracy is a threat to expertise. I don't think my views of experts and their arrogance has changed that much, but the political continuum surrounding expertise has shifted. I blame religion, because I blame religion for everything, or almost everything. Most people in our world, in our academic world, blame capitalism or neoliberalism, commodification, in Michael Burroy's terms the other day. The two analyses, I think, are quite compatible, although it turns out neither is a very good rallying cry for political mobilization outside the academy. Blaming religion doesn't get you very far. Blaming commodification and capitalism also doesn't necessarily get you very far. Although that's more of an American point of view. It gets you farther in Latin America and parts of Europe. In Europe, that suspicion of expertise, I think, has an easy target in Brussels. It's very easy to depict the Eurocrats as having this threatening octopus-like reach everywhere. The EU is very easy to demonize, just as Americans find it very easy to demonize their own federal government. It's a little perverse to demonize your own government, but it's a long American tradition. Faceless bureaucrats and specialists are always very easy targets. They also belong to that liberal world of evidence, of careful procedures, of legal protections, of transparencies, of rules. It's a really boring world, and it doesn't always generate the substantive outcomes that we would like. And I'm afraid that other than Jürgen Habermas and a few lawyers and a few academics, nobody really admires that nice liberal world of rules. But I think it's it's under threat in a way now that it hasn't been for a very long time, and we need to give it a second thought. One of the things that I think underlie that world is emotions like respect and compassion that represent a bit of substance, a bit of vision of human nature that support the formalities of liberalism. And I want to say that in both social movements and for those of us who study social movements, there's been a kind of, first a soft turn thanks to feminists, but I think then later a queer turn in social movement theory that has helped us appreciate emotions, helped us see emotions as a positive force in the world at large, in the liberal world that is now disappearing. And so I think we're better able now to use those, use appreciation of those emotions to see both what drives people, which I think is not a calculated logic of material interests, but an emotional logic of who do you trust, who do you hate, who do you like, who do you feel comfortable with, and so on. That's, I think, what drives people's politics, and we need to understand that a little better, the patterns of respect and admiration. Middle-class academics, but also middle-class activists, have a hard time understanding, I think, the ideas, the demands of other social classes, much less their feelings. Plus, we have a hard time feeling compassion for those who lack compassion. We have a blind spot for the movements of hate, the movements of certain kinds of populism. Don't get me wrong, miscomprehension between social classes, I'm sure, was worse before 1968 than it has been since. Think of the kinds of fears, the contempt that you find in crowd theory of the 19th century and so on. But neither did 1968 magically overcome that mutual incomprehension. Maybe 68 put us on a path to reconciliation and better understanding, better appreciation, compassion, and respect mutually. But I think we still have a long way to go down that path. I'll stop there.
Might need a microphone. Yeah. So I think we open the floor for questions.
I know Suzanne has a question.
A second. One more.
The main thing I was
just
thinking about is
just 1 second. Let's try present yourself.
Questions?
Present yourself, even if people know like this works for everyone. Okay, before ask the question.
Okay,
Thanks.
I'm Suzanne Staggenborg. I was wondering about your interpretation of the class dynamics, because it seems like you seem to be blaming the working class for the right wing in some ways, but really a lot of the right wing in the United States has been, more middle class, like if you think about the Goldwater movement and Orange County Republicans and all those people that drove that. And there's certainly, and the working class too is a lot more, I think, varied. Like Vietnam veterans against the war. There were a lot of, even though it was John Kerry and people like that, but there was also a lot of working class people who went to Vietnam and who turned against the war. So I think it's a lot more complicated. I don't know exactly what the breakdown is of the George Wallace vote, but I think the class dynamics are more complicated.
Yeah, I hesitate even to use, sorry, is it back on? Thank you. To even use working class, lower middle class, these are, to talk about working class has a little bit of that gauchiste romance, I think, to it. We think of the factory workers and so on who really have mostly disappeared. So I wouldn't really want to do a class analysis of it, but it's not people with PhDs and for the most part not people with college degrees. That I'm talking about, Middle Americans. Vietnam. Penny Lewis has written a book about the working class union turn against Vietnam, or, well, it didn't. I don't entirely buy it, but I would say they weren't. Eventually, everybody was against Vietnam, but what the people I'm talking about, sort of Middle Americans who really are pretty alien to specialists and experts and PhDs like us, what they turned against was the movements of the 60s, more clearly. The backlash against those movements was much stronger than anything having to do with Vietnam, I think. And that's I think, what really has fed into the rise of Reagan on through Trump. And that's right back to 68. Sorry.
Just a question of clarification. We've heard now twice that the notion of collective identity was unthinkable before 68. Why?
Unthinkable, I'm not sure. Nobody used it. I'm not sure it was unthinkable, but I do think there's a major change in our understanding of politics that had to do with an appreciation of other than class politics, other than religion, and the collective identities of race and gender that had been, well, race had been strong for a while in the U.S. Gender emerged in the 60s as an important label. It took a while for people to come up with the term. Social identity had been alive and well in social psychology, actually, but collective identity, as we understand it, why? I mean, the new social movement theory, I think, has, well, is valid enough. People were worrying about this as movements in ways they hadn't before.
Does it go beyond more essentialist notions of society? Is the more constructivist approach to how we organize groups in society? Is that?
Sure, I think that goes along with the cultural understanding of politics that emerged, for sure. Yeah.
Thanks. Eric Selbin from Southwestern. I wanted to ask both of you to talk a little more about sort of, let me see how I can make this make sense. So I wonder, Jim, in your case, whether the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination and in the ramping up of the Vietnam War, if that isn't when some of the wind begins to come out of the sails in the U.S. and some of the shifts begin to change, and especially as those working class kids are drafted and sent off to fight. And similarly, I wonder about in that period, it seems to me 66, 60, as early as 65 even in Germany and to some extent Italy, workers and to some extent students are starting to make demands and rise up and push for things, and they get a very different sort of reaction, right? I mean, that's my impression. And so I wonder if you could contrast that a little bit. Thank you.
My understanding, again, this is not something I've done research or even read up on lately. I think the working class stuck with, or the Middle Americans stuck with the war, even though their sons were being drafted and sent off longer than the sort of college-educated Americans did. I mean, which is, again, work demands an argument on something other than personal self-interest, right? This was an ideological, whether a nationalistic kind of vision for them, despite the personal cost.
Yeah, for sure it is important to look at the context, because I think that the narrative of a global event could bring about blindness toward the specific circumstances under which these similar movements developed. And I think this would be dangerous, because if we want to understand the effects of each of these turning points, they were very different because they were very much embedded in a specific type of context. So also 68 was to a different extent a crack, or a shifting moment in a different type of countries. 68 need to be understood also as more than 1 year, because, as you said, in the United States it is earlier. Sidney Tarrant's research on Italy said the cycle of protest started already in the mid-60s. But especially what was quite different was also the dynamic of the event and the capacity to function as a critical juncture if we think about the effect. So one could say, in a similar way, these movements had long-term effect, which, however, developed in different timing. So in Germany, and they were complex, because you had at the same time repression. So repression was strong, in some cases very strong, but it was always there, because after the shock there was a reorganization of those who were opposed to new culture, new challenges, and so on. And this, in several of the European countries, was the first reaction. So after 68, there was no immediate opening up of opportunities. There was a strong contrast. But the timing was long. So, for instance, in Germany, the development of the left-wing government, let's say, so first a grosse Koalition and then the SPD in power, which can be considered as an effect of 68, happened earlier than in France, and in France it happened earlier than in the Italian case. So timing was important and was related also with the capacity of those who were, of the incumbents, of those who were challenged to resist and organize. And I think that it was also quite different, and this I was thinking about also Jim's presentation of the American case. So some of the cases in Europe, 68 is remembered as a left-wing type of event. The encounter with the working class was different in extent and duration. In Italy, there was the so-called long autumn, which from the student movement of 68, there was a diffusion in the factories in 69, and it lasted longer. In France, there were the Grenelle Agreement, and that type of potential encounters with the student movement was blocked. So I think it is quite nuanced, but it is a different reactions, and then probably it is also different the ways in which 68 impacted on the movements themselves. So in the European countries I addressed, it was a challenge on the left and for the left. So it was clearly a transformative event, but that was rooted in the history of events, and we talked about New Left and so on. This was very different in the United States. It was very different since the beginning, because the Port-Huron statement was not so clearly identified in the ideological way as it was in Europe, but it was also different later on. So that I was thinking recently about the term intersectionality, which developed not by chance in the United States, and which, when I have to translate into European language, I think, yes, this is left-wing progressive position that normally put together different type of sources of repression and so on. But as Jim was mentioning, in the United States, you had this sort of say plurality of new social movements which emerged as quite fragmented and differentiated from each other. In Europe is much more a history within the left, which developed in different forms, but I think it is ideologically different. So, and I think it is very important, this different type of context and the importance of the reactions. Just, I think it is also important because one of the moment in which we are also living is a moment in which we have the impressions that from the successful movements of the squares in 2011, we are now, the effect was a move to the right. So if you look at the world in 2011-2015, you have the impression of progress. If you look in 2016, 17, 18, you say it is a history of right-wing coming out, winning from the conflict. This is in part also a parallel perspective if you look at 68. So 68 was not perceived as successful for a long time. There was an immediate reactions, and the immediate readings was, well, after 68 we had de Gaulle, we had the end of the center-left governments in Italy, we had focus, backlash, polarization, and so on. So I think that's also thinking about long-term reactions is useful to go beyond the perspective that it should be changes immediately or never. So.
Okay, Mario Diani. Apologies for being cynical and gloomy, but I think that the picture doesn't quite stack up, I think, in this sense. When we talk about the links between I very much agree with the fact that there were at least two 1968, one working class activism and students, but the problem, especially in Europe and for a while, the link was provided by the organizational structures of the left, the traditional left, and as well as the new left, which were quarreling and fighting, but were much more in dialogue than one might think. And now, in order to assess the relationship between classes, okay, you pointed out the shortcomings in many ways on the working class myth, but I would also comment slightly about the new middle class myth. And it seems to me that one of the big differences, I repeat perhaps what I said last night, but I mean, the 60s were first years that followed unprecedented economic growth, the reconstruction of the war. Here now, we are regarding what Mr. Trickett thinks, we are now out of the worst recession after World War II, which has destroyed more money, more wealth than the 1929 recession, first. Second, there was a strong push towards the welfare state following the fact that, again, the end of the war and Beveridge was not far away in Britain, and so there was a push and the sense that, it's true there was backlash, etc., but the widespread notion was that the driving force was behind the progressive, the left, and in phases of growth, and this is very blatant in Italy, but I suspect not only in Italy, consensus was a phase in which all demands stick together because, by and large, state intervention, and of course, Christian Democrat was clientelistic in Italy, but I think it applies as well. Growth of social investment, etc., could sort of guarantee secure outcomes for everybody. Now it's very easy to work together if you back somebody else's demands and they pay off and you, at the same time, you feel it. What happens when the crisis starts, namely the late 70s? And I think it was not just the fact that class barriers were reproduced, and it was also the new middle class, willing or not, consciously or not, that carved out a niche, partially by consolidating themselves, making a foothold in the traditional parties of the left, and there is evidence for that, partially building new structures, which all well-meaning, important, useful, I'm not questioning that. But one of the results was that the break between the working class starting. It was not just the working class that reasserted its identity, but also the other way around, the new middle class, which snubbed massively. I remember the contempt with which the new left activists in Milan in the late 70s, whether it was Radio Popolare, whether it was the university, looked down upon the lower class people. I remember the class structure reproducing entirely, even in the so-called new social movements of the neo-Oriental religious meditational kind, with the orange people, Rajneesh people, with the psychiatrists and the middle class people running the show, and the guys from the middle class, all wearing orange, of course, but then washing up the dishes in the kitchen of their restaurant. All these mechanisms, the end of the 70s, reproduced and reasserted new classes, and the new middle class, new people, also played their own class interest, also disalienated the rest. It's not just the working class forgetting about it.
I'm not so sure, in the sense that, so when I started this analysis, which is based especially on readings of 68, but also involve research done on that period, I started with this, sharing this impression, now we live in a moment of crisis, that was a moment of opening up of opportunities. But what I read, and which pushed me also to rethink about myself, just 12 years old, so, but I was already in the high school, so it's already belonged to the movement, was not the perceptions of growth. So it was a perception of fascism which was incumbent in Italy, because in Southern Europe there were the other three big countries with authoritarian regimes. In Germany it was also a discourse of fascists coming back. United States was coming out from McCarthyism, but it was still felt as a dangerous type of enemy. And there was also still very much the perceptions that it was important to mobilize because the moment was a dangerous moment, because there was still risk of nuclear war, still also on this side, on the side of the perceptions. On the side of who belonged to the student movement, their work, Olivier's work and the other works, and also my own memories and what I read, tells us that the students were not all middle-class people. Many people, I still remember from my student collective, were coming from the countryside, were peasants, from peasants' families, and they were not those who were proud and trustful that they were going to be more successful than their own relatives and so on. They were living in conditions that they perceived as challenging for them, because it was clear that the labor market for intellectuals was going to become more crowded and more difficult to enter to. And because there was also perceptions of interest, which were not the interest of the middle class, but this broad type of class behaviors was there. Maybe in Milan you didn't have this, but in Sicily there was this. No, I know that it is also different visions, but I think that this should not be forgotten. That it was the period in which mass universities was opening up, but it was not people who arrived and say, now we are happy because we are going to be successful in the societies. There was grievances about all the type of economic and social frustration. There was a perception of being diverse and being having a more difficult life than the bourgeois kids who were. So I think that this is important.
If I could say one thing about sort of the long economic cycles, which some of us heard a lot about the other day from Michael Burroy, who put them in very sort of structural terms. Society responds to marketization and so on. It seems to me one of the significant things to remember about the 1970s, or to me, what's important about the backlash movements in the U.S. of the 1970s, is that they were used by rich people's movements. So that, yes, there was an economic crisis, but corporations and rich people really took advantage of that crisis in a very organized way. And it was not, to me, it's not just some internal collapse of the Fordist system that from inherent contradictions. It was pulled apart very actively by people who took advantage of the moral majority, who took advantage of these right-wing voting patterns, and within the Republican Party. So.
Olivier Filiol, I just wanted to first to say something about this collective identity thing that is coming back. Like we didn't talk about collective identity before. I don't think it's true at all. I mean, we had other terms. Think about like E.P. Thompson, 1966. It's all about collective identity. Think about Bloomer, the we feeling. It's all about collective identity and building collective identity. So we have to be very careful. I mean, we of course we did invent a new term, like coin a new term in social movement theory at one point, collective identity. But I mean, since we do social sciences, since the beginning of 19th century, we're just obsessed about how to build a community, a nation, and a collective identity. And this is something we have to be very careful with. We have our own specific little vocabulary, but I mean, it's just a translation of very big, concepts, which are as old as social sciences. That was just like a comment. Donata, I really like your presentation about like this thing about memory, and it rings a bell about like for example, Christine Ross or Passerini and those books about like memory. I just wanted to ask you a question. Do you have any, can you say something about the specificity of the memory struggles about 68 compared to like other memory struggles? Since I'm French, I'm thinking immediately about the French Revolution and the Vendée that T was working on like a long time ago. And this, for example, memory struggle about like the French Revolution, in my opinion, has had very different effects in terms of voting, geographical distribution of people, etc. The white part, the white part of Vendée or the blue part of Vendée, things like that. And I was wondering if for 68 we could, I have no idea, if we could like compare if there are like differences or it's always the same, like those memory struggles. Another question is, perhaps for the two, is about the commemorations, like the successive commemorations. In France, it took a specific path, like France, the 78, 88. Each time this is something different which is popping up in terms of critics of 68 and the responsibility of 68ers in so many troubles and things that appeared after. And I was wondering, is this exactly the same? Yesterday I was suggesting perhaps it was the same in America with the movement, but perhaps it's different. I'm pretty sure it's different in Italy, for obvious reasons, not Germany, and of course in Japan. So, I mean, are you aware, or have you any idea of like how to specify the differences between those different commemorations, how it evolved? Because I don't think it's the same path that was followed, and I think in itself it's a nice question, and I mean, nice thing to work on. Another remark is about like. In your presentation, it seems you try to draw some significant similarities between 68 and the nowadays situation. But what about the big differences? I mean, for me, I only see differences in the sense that, just to give you some example, for the 68ers in France, there was an expression, history, I don't know if it makes any sense in English, but history is biting our neck. Like, revolution is for tomorrow. So if we don't go now, we'll miss the train of history. And this is, I think this was very strong in the, I mean, in the brain of our 68ers at that time. Today, not at all. Of course, the activists you interview are trying to say, okay, something is coming, we're optimistic, but it's also strategic language. And in terms of analysis, I mean, from my point of view, nothing like that is happening. I mean, in 68, you have like the third worldism, which is very strong. Vietnam is about to win a war against America, which is something, I don't know if we can even imagine what it means at that time. It's exactly like 1905, when the Japanese are defeating the Russians, like white people, for the first time in history. It's kind of the same. So today, we don't have anything like that. I mean, there is no near victory in any respect. Everything is lost. And the contemporary movements are just reacting. They're not proactive at all in the sense that they are not like trying to get new rights or new advantages. No, just like to try to keep something because everything is taken from them. So I fully agree about like the links you make between 68 and today, but it's more the links activists today are trying to mobilize in a strategic way. In terms of analysis, I think we're very far from the situation of 68. I don't know if it's my comment or question is clear, but that's it.
No, it's very clear. Let me start with E.P. Thompson and collective identity, because I think that it is not by chance that E.P. Thompson is an important figure of the New Left. Because I think you can say many analyses also of the past address the issues of constructions of identities, but in the traditional Marxist visions, class consciousness emerged almost from automatically, and E.P. Thompson, with these visions of humanitarian socialism, contingency, and so on, brought about also this specific focus on how the British working class made itself. And so I think that to a certain extent, it is also true that there is a very specific focus on this, even if, of course, there were different attempts. On the comparative memory struggles, I think it's very interesting. What I can compare is the research we did on the memory of transitions and the memory of 68, because they were both important turning points, transformative events, and so on. But one is a more specific movement memory, and the other one is an institutional memory as well. And there, what you have is, of course, the larger impact of institutional visions in the case of institutional events and sort of stronger power and stronger investment by the state in order to appropriate this memory. So the chapter by Eric Neveu opens up with the questions, will Macron build up an official vision of 68 and how it would look like? there is not yet this attempt. There are not museums or such things of 68. Then there is another specificity of 68, is those who live there are still alive. So there is also this strong selective visions of 68, is male, is in the case of France is Paris, it is students and so on. And the fact that there has been a focusing on a few testimonials of 68 has produced this strong selectivity. And in fact, a very interesting book on 68 and the work also of various historians is interesting, and your work as well, in challenging this selective vision. Then I think there are also, and they should be studied in a comparative analysis, different degrees of plurality. So all the three questions which I asked at the end also developed in different ways in different countries. So the degree of selectivity, plurality, and consolidation varies. And there is an interesting research by Jan Kubik and Bernard on the memory of 1989. And they've been looking at anniversaries and celebrations. And they point at different ways in which events are remembered in compatible ways. So they take the Polish examples as the worst case in which memory is strongly split, and it brings about a removal of what happened. While they then describe, take the example of the Czech Republic as an example instead of a plural memory. I think this type of work is interesting because the memory is activated, and they talk also about memory activists to a certain extent. Changes, and I was thinking another element which is also relevant thinking about knowledge is the degree of to which an event became historicized in the sense of was addressed by professionals. So for 68, one of the claim is there is no historical consolidated visions of 68. Yet, in part because it's an event on which there is still a lot of contestation, and in part because for various reasons. Third issues, and I think in this, Marius, and your questions are similar about the emphasis I put on similarities. It is true there are a lot also of differences, and I didn't want to deny them, and I didn't want to point, I say, at the absolute reality of what was happening in 68 and what is happening now, but rather at the ways in which similar resonant perceptions emerged. But I agree that they are different times. I think both you and Mario are more pessimistic than me. I still see the movements as going on and the potentials for these critical junctures to emerge, but this maybe in a couple of years in the next conference we can discuss.
Thank you, Filip Balonovic. I was wondering about what do you think? I will try to shift a bit the discussion at the more abstract conceptual level. What what would be the materialist interpretation of the 68? In my view, and then you have already tackled this issue, how the new left and the old left actually communicated during the 1968. The way I understand the 1968 is that the very nature of alienation from the production process in the orthodox Marxist interpretation kind of shifted away also to the cultural and social level. This is what the new left actually is about. So alienation, yes, in economic terms at the level of production, but also alienation at the level of society as a whole and at the cultural level as well. So this is actually what the new left and the old left try to communicate with each other. And of course that the rigid or hierarchically organized old left was highly skeptical upon insistence on the different stage of capital realization or circulation. So instead of talking about production, people started talking about consumption and the effects that the consumption itself has or had on the society as a whole. So the 68, in my view, still belongs to the modern times. It's still, Marcuse was talking about who was embraced by the student movement in the same way like Sartre was in France, whereas Lacan, whom you mentioned, and Althusser were highly rejected by the student movement in France. So Marcuse was talking about a different totality. So we still have this modern notion of totality, of something which is interconnected with each other. So the way I see the 68 is that this year still belongs to the modern times. So in terms of political processes, the way the 68 was interpreted afterwards, and when we are thinking about Foucault and other authors who've benefited a lot in their academic work and philosophical work from the 68, I think that this non-materialist or even anti-materialist interpretation of Foucault and others actually does not correspond fully to the reality of 1968, because regardless of whether these students were working class, middle class, or any other class, I think their attempt to challenge the society as a whole, this from the situationalist movement, we know about this expression of society of spectacle. So the way they were doing it was actually going towards the working class movement, actually inviting them to cooperate. In France, we know that shortly after the 68, 9 million workers were on strike. So I was wondering, so in the end, do you think that that 68 was in a way misinterpreted afterwards by some authors, which managed to kind of particularize the resistance, even though the 68 was still about the totality, was still about the comprehensive total critique of capitalism from different perspectives?
Okay. We gathered the last questions, and then we have one. If anyone wants to ask something, please, this is the last round.
Oh, yes, I'll try to piggyback on that question. Mine was a broad question about the role of various movements after 68. As markers, I would take 77 in Italy, but also the punk movement in the UK, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then, of course, the alter globalization movement until 2000. How these mark certain passages is important for me. 68, I was thinking of Boltanski and Chiappello's use of artistic critique and political critique, right? How capitalism restructures itself by integrating artistic critique, which is a critique of alienation, and not integrating, of course, the political economic, the critique of political economy on redistribution of wealth. And by restructuring itself, you get this proliferation of lifestyles, of differences which explode in 77 quite clearly. Then the defeat of the political, economic, class-based critique is really evident in 1989. And at that point, with the globalization of the capitalist system, the critique of the distribution of wealth becomes increasingly marginal. Nowadays, the reason why you don't get a total critique of capitalism is that it is fairly accepted that you can reclaim a higher wage, you can strike in your sector. That's okay, but that's not the basis for a political strike, for a general strike. Even all the social revolutionary like Sorel, the image of that got completely swallowed. It's out of the imaginary nowadays. And then the alter globalization movement has this double component, I think, that we can look at now from an historical perspective, because it's perceived to be a leftist movement, but it's also a sovereign movement, because in Seattle, you get unions that participate that want to strike down NAFTA, and the great irony is that Donald Trump is probably the one who's going to strike down NAFTA, and who ran really clearly in his campaign. This is not reported oftentimes, but it was prominent in his campaign, the fact that he wanted to go beyond that, right? And so you get to 2011, and then to the political outcome of this, with this powerful return of sovereignty, right? It's very strong in Europe right now, economic sovereignty against the European Union, against, so just to, if you want to comment on these flows and the roles that movements played as catalyzers of how we perceive and understand capitalism nowadays, and the role that critiques play.
Priska Daffy is my name. I have a question to Donatella. You mentioned the possibility and perhaps also difficulties of a transition of the memory of 68 from the, let's say, I call that old generation, the involved generation, to a new generation of activists. And I was wondering actually how that is possible and how easily that is possible. And the reason why I'm asking is two observations. First, I was at an event recently in Frankfurt about 68, and Frankfurt for the German 68 movement was a quite central place. And the impression I got there was that very much the memory of 68 is very much dominated by those previously involved scholars that would, at least at this event, very little allow different interpretations of this past by other scholars, but also by other younger activists. And the other observation why I'm asking this is, we did interviews with present-day activists about 68 and how they reflect about it. And many of the younger activists said, yes, it's very important, but we don't talk about it much, and it's not much reflected, and it's a lot embodied by previously involved people. So this is why I wonder, how can this transition be possible? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. My question is partly a follow-up to what Philip said earlier, which I strongly agree with. And because I think that, as partially also Jim was saying earlier, there are different 68, and there are in particular different narratives, okay, of 1968. And I've been conducting research both on Italy and on Spain on that, on the different narratives that were developed, okay, on about the long 68 in both countries, mainly being around two poles: the idea of 68 a struggle, okay, the more politically charged component of it, and the more countercultural, generational component of it. And the result of this, at least for what I've seen in Italy and Spain, is that this countercultural narrative has been gaining ground in public discourse mostly in the last 20-25 years. Okay, and there is the hegemony of a certain representation of 1968 as mostly as, liberal, anti-authoritarian, that had nothing to do with working class, that had nothing to do with the idea of a general change of society, and so on, which have been more and more amplified. And in a context of globalization of memory that we're also seeing, okay, and we cannot forget, of course, that a big part of the global cultural productions comes from the US, okay? So traits that are probably mostly relevant there, okay, then become also frames through which 68 is examined elsewhere. So my question is, since this is the situation now, okay, there is the hegemony of this narrative, and we know that memory is far more important than history itself in determining, in structuring the environment. Now what is to be done? In the sense that for people who aim somewhat to recompose, okay, this idea of anti-authoritarianism and class-based organization, do we have somewhat to reclaim 1968 back, trying to impose a different narrative, or is it easier and maybe more efficient somewhat to forget about it?
I try to be short and selective and not consolidated. Start with Philippe questions. One easy and short way to address the questions is to refer to interpretation of 68 as the last movement of the old type and the first of the new type, which was a bit in Turen's type of analysis and so on. But probably also what one should say is that 68 could be considered as a movement if we want to use a shortcut. But in reality, it was a cycle of protest, it was campaigns, it was what Turen called a lutte, so different, a struggle, different from a social movement. So to say there were a lot of things inside. If you take 68 in Southern Europe and in Latin America, it was also a movement for democracy and democratization. So you had many claims. So I think it also depends on what you considered. You said, and you asked what would be the material and what is, and you state the materialist understanding and what would be, and you define the movement as modern. Now, in order to address the questions, we should see what you will take as counter concepts. So, materialist vision of 68, I would say one of the characteristics of 68 and its interpretations is that it challenges the traditional Marxist type of analysis in terms of class per se, and it brings in the humanitarian vision of socialism of E.P. Thompson, the critical Frankfurt theories, which give more leverage to culture, contingency, agency, and so on. And in terms of modernity, I think that there are all these different type of actions, protests during 68 that follow different type of logic. So who cited the 9 million workers on strike in France, and it is true, 68 and May was a big strike. Everything was on strike. But it was also several other things, and so probably the definition of movements is to be taken as a narrative itself. Also, I think what is relevant is that there were many categories in terms of classes, but also the generational aspects. So in John Trickett interviews, but also in other analysis, the workers were not just mobilizing as workers, but they belonged to a generation which was also affected by general type of transformations. Boltanski, Chapelot, and the type of effects on 68. I found Boltanski and Chapelot interesting and inspiring, but I would not overemphasize the narrative of 68 as sort of artistic and individualistic type of critique, or the understand. There is in the book a chapter by Colin Crouch who point at these different visions and different effects of 68 as challenging a certain vision of class and class solidarity, but I wouldn't go to the extreme of considering it as building up the basis of a new spirit of capitalism, I think. And in terms of the memory of 68, should we change it or forget about it? My impression is that it is changing already, but here I can have the optimistic bias. But consider that as a fact. We have in the British developments Corbyn, a 68er, who is meeting with the momentum generations. And I think the citations which I mentioned testifies of these perceptions that there is a potential for discussion that goes beyond those self-appointed representative of 68, the male type of narrative, and the successful ones, because it is always those 3 or 4 and I think that this potential for changes is not something that we produce as scholars on the basis of the influence of our readings, but it is in the ways in which new events can emerge that catalyze a different vision and sort of bring back a return to 68. It could also be sometimes contingent. So Marxism is very much discussed in this time also because there is the 200 anniversaries, and it can also open space for attention narratives and so on. But I think that's beyond what we think. These elements, I started Corbyn, but also Sanders is a 68 generations that can speak very well to the millennials. The millennials liked Corbyn, Sanders and Corbyn and so on. So I think that also there is inaction during the type of encounters of different generations, especially the 68 and the new one, this potential for a different readings to it.
So thanks, Donatella. Thanks, Jim. We meet downstairs for the picture and for those who want to join us for a dinner.
Wait, may I say that I found the idea of the picture very nice, but also very challenging. One of the most challenging things of the conference, because we are so many. So I'm looking forward.
I have an idea. I have an idea.
It's on the stairs?
Out front.
Lorenzo, maybe what I saw is that in the past, even before 68, when they wanted to take a picture of many people, stairways.
So please don't disappear. Wait for us downstairs.